It's UofL Today on 93.9 The Phil. Here's your host, Mark Hebert.
Welcome to UofL Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Phil. For those of you who have listened to the program before, you know that this is the show that's all about the great stuff going on at the university. We talk about research, we talk to students, we talk to faculty and staff, so hopefully you'll stick around for the next half hour and maybe you'll learn something. Well, maybe you've heard of Cassini. That's the satellite that's sending back all those great images and research from the planet Saturn. Well, part of Cassini's mission was focus on the work of Tim Dowling, who is a professor here at the University of Louisville. So we'll have Tim on to talk about that Cassini mission and also talk a little bit about Jupiter as well. And UofL is doing some amazing work trying to improve the health of residents in the Smoketown neighborhood. We'll talk about that as well, coming up a little bit later on in the show. But first, we hear a lot about how our country's civil rights history perhaps isn't portrayed properly in the schools. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, and maybe those civil rights and other movements in America actually did do a good job of expressing themselves and led to other movements. Lara Kelland, is a professor of history here at the University of Louisville, and she talks about that in a book, right?
Indeed, that's true.
Okay, well, welcome to the show first off.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
And shockingly, we have never met. You've been at UofL for 7 years, right?
6 is my 6
years. 6
yep.
years. Okay.
Yep.
And so
time sure flies.
Time flies. So what do you teach, particularly in history?
So I'm currently in both history and humanities. So I just moved half of my line over to humanities. But in history, I'm right now the only faculty member in our public history track. So I teach U.S. history courses, historical methods for undergrads, but I also do most of the grad teaching in the public history track. So I'm teaching MA students about public history methods and approaches.
Well, what's the difference between public history and plain old history?
Sure, what a great question.
Well, seems like an obvious one.
Yes. So public history is a methods field that trains people to work in museums, in historic preservation, in oral history, in archives. So it takes the scholarship and ideas that are generated in academic history and puts them in conversation with more popular ideas of the past in public-facing institutions.
Gotcha. All right. So that's a little bit different.
It's applied. Sort of the short, quick.
All right. So what do students do with that degree?
Sure.
If they get a degree in public history or history in general, what do they do?
Sure. So again, they're usually trained pretty broadly and are able to access a lot of careers. A lot of our students go into museums, either curatorial work or education. A number of our students do work in archives, either university archives, public archives, or even in some cases private archives. Historic preservation, which can encompass things like historic walking tours and policy work that leads to historical preservation designation. Digital history, a really wide array of careers. Yeah.
Again, we're talking to Lara Kelland, who is a professor of history at the University of Louisville. You also wrote a book called Cleo's Foot Soldier. What's it about?
Sure. So this is where my scholarship tries to intersect with my public history work. So it looks comparatively at 5 different social movements in the mid-20th century and looks at the ways in which those social movement activists were cultural activists, and in particular the way that they used history within their movements. So it looks at civil rights, the Black Power movement, women's liberation, gay liberation, and the American Indian movement, and sort of compares the way that activists in those movements used history to build new identities, political identities, to justify their work. It looks at things like newspaper articles and popular education efforts, the development of tribal colleges in the American Indian movement. So both kind of history efforts within the movement and within that identity group and that community, and also the way that they interacted with more mainstream institutions.
So in those movements then, did they do a good job of telling their own story, for lack of a better term, or did they not? Because as I said in my intro, sometimes we get, we hear criticism that the schools aren't doing a good enough job from a Black perspective teaching about the civil rights movement and those kinds of things.
Well, I think what my work shows is that they were doing a couple different things, that they were first and foremost faced inward, that they were refuting ideas that were in mainstream scholarship about Black history, about American Indian history, which at the time in the 1960s and 70s were highly biased, not favorable, and not rigorously engaging sort of the the complexity of their past, right? So these activists, their first goals and intentions were to educate within their movements. There are some projects that I look at that do make some curricular interventions that started to sort of look at more broad education. Part of what I'm trying to do is historicize actually the rise of my field. And so the way that my field has been explained is that public historians emerged in the academy in the 1970s and 80s and were all these well-intentioned liberals, right, that decided to be more democratic. And part of what my work is doing is saying, yeah, that was going on, but also there was pressure from identity-based groups, right, that were also pushing to make those changes. So in some ways, I would argue that they laid the groundwork, that they were working in tandem with some academics that were trying to make the American past and the study of the American past more pluralist and more complex, but that first and foremost, their interests were facing within their movements.
So they were trying to educate their own members. They had a small pool of folks, that obviously grew, like I'm taking the civil rights movement as an example. So they had a small pool of people, but then did that transcend that small group of people into the American soul, the rest of America? You know what I'm saying?
Right. Well, I wouldn't say that those activists necessarily within their lives' work got to, making a major impact on curriculum, but that they were part of a larger movement to make the American past more pluralist. So where I end Cleo's Foot Soldiers is looking at the culture wars in the 1990s, and in particular in museums. Curriculum was part of this too, but the pressure to be more inclusive, the rise of more identity-based movements on the museums on the U.S. Capitol Mall. So I'm tracing the way that they are having impact on starting to shift this larger attitude about who is history for and what does it do.
And that inclusiveness is still going on today, isn't
Absolutely.
it? That more inclusiveness.
Yep.
All right, so what can we learn? So we've got, going forward, everybody says history repeats itself.
Sure.
So what can we learn about these movements of the past and how they might set an example for the potential movements of the future?
Sure. So I just gave a talk at the Louisville Free Public Library that was part of this fantastic series. And sort of where I ended my remarks that evening were that we don't fully understand and engage, even in scholarship, these ideas of cultural work in social movements. I think we think of social movements as marching in the street. And what a group of scholars are now doing is showing the ways in which culture actually has a really meaningful impact. So my comments ended with the notion that we all have access to cultural production. We have access to social media, we make art. All of us can create ideas and images about the past and about social movements. So I just encouraged everyone to feel like they were authors and creators of history and historical change.
All right, well, Lara Kelland, are we having a social movement right now? Are we in the middle of one
how
right
many
now?
of them?
Always. Is there a big one right now? Because of what we see in our country and the political divisiveness and
Right. Well, I think we're in a moment of larger, moving towards larger tolerance and patience and plurality. That is certainly a backlash to our current administration. I would also point to the LGBTQ movement as making some significant inroads, and of course, Black Lives Matter being a real shift in that long Black freedom struggle. So
yes is the answer.
Yes.
Yes is the answer, right?
Historians are not good at short answers. Yes,
so
absolutely,
yes, we are
Mark.
seeing a social movement right now, or social movements, plural right now, still ongoing.
Absolutely.
Okay, Lara Kelland, appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you so much.
Tim Dowling is an astronomy professor at the University of Louisville who also teaches atmospheric science, and he gets really excited when his theories about far-off planets turn out to be true. Right, Tim?
I get excited when they're not true as well.
Well, we get more excited when they are true, because then you can come and brag about yourself. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Cassini. What is it, a probe? Is that what they call it?
No, it was an orbiter, very long, 13 years. It was a 4-year mission, but it became a 13-year mission.
Okay. And Cassini left when? What year did Cassini leave? What year it got to Saturn 2 years ago? Right?
This is you're thinking of maybe Juno,
I'm
which
sorry.
is on
Yeah,
Jupiter. Yeah. So Cassini arrived. I think it was 2004. It was the same year that we had the whole Planetary Science Conference here in Louisville. Just coincidentally, and so then they ran for 4 years, the original mission, and then they just kept extending it. It's one of these flagships that had everything on it, and it was such a versatile mission that they extended it to a full 13 years. But it was the last 20 orbits, this proximity orbits that got in between the rings and the planet that are the exciting ones that we're talking about.
Okay. So what's new?
So back 10 years ago, two colleagues and I figured out how to get the length of the day on Saturn, which we've been trying to do that since 1790s. The first paper, actually peer-reviewed paper published on this, 1794, by Herschel, the guy who discovered the Uranus, the planet Uranus, that's the same year that Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. It's the same year that
back a little ways, huh?
It's the same year that Kentucky got its star on the flag.
On the flag?
Yeah, Kentucky and Vermont. It's 1794. So it's been over 220 years we've been trying to get this darn number. And the reason it's hard with Saturn is because the magnetic field is pointed, instead of being tilted like Earth and Jupiter, it's pointed straight up. So it's like a lighthouse where the beacon is shining, but it's shining straight up and you can't see any spin.
Okay.
So we had no idea what the day is, and that really throws a wrench in the works for anything you're trying to do. Whether you're trying to figure out the winds of the atmosphere or whether you're trying to figure out the interior structure, you just don't know what you don't even know what to do without, you don't have time, basically. You don't have longitude. Right. So in 2009, we figured out how to get it by looking at the atmospheric waves, the really large atmospheric waves, and published a result which was 10 hours, 34 minutes.
So the day on Saturn
is 10 hours.
Ours is 24 hours.
24, right.
All right, so there's
just
10 hours.
a little bit more than twice as fast. So 10 hours, 34 minutes. And to compare, Jupiter's also fast. It's 9 hours and 55 minutes. So, but we knew Jupiter because it's got a nice tilt. So we got this number, and the question is, is it right? We have no idea. So people started using it, and some people started using the official number, which is 10 hours, 39 minutes. It's full 5 minutes, which is a disaster for doing any kind of precise work at all. 5 minutes is ridiculous. So what's exciting is this year, at the beginning of 2019, another paper came out from a completely independent study. And they looked not at waves in the atmosphere, but waves in the inner ring, called the C ring. We have A, B, and C ring, outer, middle, and inner ring of Saturn. So they're looking at ring waves, which are excited by the same large mass anomalies inside the planet itself that are exciting our waves. And so we're kind of on the outside of the planet, and they're on the inside of the ring. So it's kind of as close as you can get. And they got 10 hours and 34 minutes.
The same thing you had.
Yeah.
So now we've got two groups of researchers that have the same
number.
The same
independent.
Number
and it's the first time in 225 years that we had two numbers that were statistically the same.
Okay.
So that's starting to converge. So that's exciting.
All right. Again, we're talking with Tim Dowling, who's an astronomy professor at the University of Louisville, and we're talking about Saturn right now. So what's the big deal? So you've nailed down exactly how long the day is. It's 10 hours and 34 minutes.
Well, there's
Saturn.
two.
So why is that?
There's two sides to the coin. One is now you can run with that number and start getting really detailed interior structure and things like that. But from my point of view, it's how we did it 10 years ago, because of the understanding how the jet streams work on Saturn. And it's not like Earth where we have only one or two jet streams. There's a dozen jet streams, and they go back and forth. And it's really hard to understand how they're, what we say, stable, how they don't just curl up into a big, like pink soup. And so that detail of how we figured out the jets are stable on both Jupiter and Saturn is very fundamental. And it's actually, there are jets in some important engineering structures. For example, fusion tokamaks, which are supposed to make energy out of fusion. It would be like an unlimited supply of energy. And it's really hard, because it has to be 1,000,000 degrees, it's really hard to contain the plasma. And so they have this thing called a tokamak, which is a huge bagel, an enormous bagel, and they try to trap with magnetic fields, they try to trap the plasma in the core of this bagel. And so they have instabilities, as you might imagine, just lots of them. They've been plagued with them for decades and decades. They put billions of dollars into this thing. And so what they discovered is, to get high confinement, they have to have these jets. And the jets were discovered almost serendipitously to be, when the jets form, jet streams form, you get what you want. And so what we're saying is we understand how Jupiter does it, and how Saturn does it. And they have never run an experiment using that concept.
So let me put it in layman's terms for the guy that's a communications major from Western Kentucky University and doesn't understand the depth of this stuff. I think what you're saying is you can take what you've learned about those jet streams on two planets, Saturn and Jupiter, perhaps apply them to science here,
to engineering,
to engineering here, to come up with potentially a new energy source. Is it
to solve one of the,
or to stabilize an energy source?
Well, they've never made it work. They've never made the fusion reactors work. So if it's in fact the case that controlling the jets, the zonal jets, as we suspect, is the key, or one of the main problems to overcome, then we think we might have, basically from Jupiter, from understanding how Jupiter does it. Jupiter is very complicated. What they're asking for in the engineering context is may not even be as complicated as Jupiter's already showing us how to do. So if we can transfer that knowledge over to the engineering of these plasma devices, then that's really exciting. So that's fun, but it's a cross-disciplinary, and as you know, that takes a lot of patience.
It may be a little while.
Yeah. Actually, this June I'm going to my first conference where I'm face to face talking to those guys in San Diego. So it's exciting.
And is that what you're going to talk about at this conference?
Yeah. So it's basically we think we have it for Jupiter. Here's how it works on Jupiter, and we should engineer the plasma fusion devices do it the same way Jupiter does it.
Okay, but again, it still could be several years before they get a chance to test the stabilization, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Okay. And you talked about Jupiter a little bit, and we've talked about it on this program before. You also found I'm trying to remember, it's the jet streams, but it's
the
also
deep ones.
the vertical
right.
streams,
So
on Jupiter that you kind of talked about years and years and years ago,
right.
And it turns out you were right about how they work, right?
So it turns out the same theory that got us the day on Saturn correctly also predicted that the jet streams on Jupiter would be very deep. And so that's kind of exciting because it's one theory that's predicting the two. That's why we're trying to do the cross-disciplinary thing. But yeah, so now they're using, basically they get the spacecraft like Juno and Jupiter get really, really close. And you can, if you do lots and lots of orbits and you end up eventually after a couple of years you circle the planet, the data you get on the outside is just like if you went to the doctor's office and went through an MRI. So it's like you're passing Jupiter through an MRI. And so you just have to be patient and build it up. It just takes longer is all. But we're almost there. The mission's slightly more than halfway done, Juno. And they're getting really nice results. It looks like instead of a core, it's more like a Uranus or a Neptune, like an ice giant inside of Jupiter. It's all diffuse out to about half the depth.
Is that not what you thought was?
No. Most people thought there would be like a central core of about 10 Earth masses inside this very large planet. And it turns out it's all mixed out and diffuse. And it's more like, you should think of the inside of Jupiter as being like a Uranus or a Neptune.
Okay, well, I don't know what's in a Uranus or
well,
Neptune.
Those are the other two big, we have 4 big planets, and those are the other 2.
I got you. We're talking with Tim Dowling, who's an astronomy professor at the University of Louisville. So what does all this mean for science here on Earth? How can we apply what you guys are looking at in outer space and in the planetary system and finding these things out? Well, you already talked about one application.
Yeah, one of the things you always want is to be able to pull what you learn from the planets back to Earth. So I think in my field, which is meteorology, if Earth, we only have Earth is the only sort of accessible, habitable planet, you could put it that way. So we really have to understand it, what we're doing to it, what we potentially could be doing to it. And so if you only study Earth itself and say, I'm doing that because it's the one I live in and it's the most important, you're going to miss all of the things you would gain by studying Venus to the right or Mars to the left or Jupiter. And so what we try to do is get out of the box and look at the larger picture and see how weather and meteorology works in general at different cases. And so it turns out Jupiter and Saturn are actually simpler. And so we study them. They're even simpler than the oceans. Mm-hmm. So we learn things from them and bring it back. I mean, we're challenged by not having as much data, but it turns out we're more than 50 years into planetary exploration now, so the data are actually pretty good.
I don't think I've ever asked you this, but I'm going to ask you it now. The way we're running our planet is the ground. In 150 years, are we going to be going to Mars or someplace, living somewhere else?
Mars is tough because if you take I'll tell you what Mars is.
Else. You pick the planet.
There isn't. That's the point, Mark. There isn't anywhere else.
So we better take care of Earth the way it is.
Yeah, and I think we will be okay. But there was actually a collaboration between scientists, engineers, and politicians that was recently successful, and that's called the Montreal Protocol. And that was recognizing that the ozone hole was actually being caused by humans, and then doing the regulations, and not without lots of fights and political battles, but they had the Montreal Protocol, and that is holding and working, and the ozone hole is healing. And so the climate change is just like that. Discover the problem and then start to do policy changes, but it's just much larger problem. So, but I'm optimistic.
All right, Tim Dowling, always fun talking to you. Kentucky's health ranks 45th out of 50 states in the United States. That is not a good number, and we are trying to turn that around here in the state of Kentucky, and specifically here in Louisville. We're too fat, we smoke too much, don't do enough preventive health care. So as I said, U of L is trying to turn that around. Theo Edmonds is an assistant professor in health management at the School of Public Health and Information Sciences, and he's working with folks in one Louisville neighborhood down in Smoketown to try and improve those health numbers. Theo, thanks for being on the show.
Happy to be here.
Glad you're here. What do you do? What's your job?
What we look at is how culture shapes health. Most of the time we think of culture as something that has to be overcome for health to get better, but actually what we do is look at it as the very foundation to build from, because every community has assets and cultural assets that often go unnoticed. We think about all the time things that we want a community to do to change without really recognizing what assets there are to build from. And so we take an asset-based approach that really recognizes that every community has a place to start and something that they already value. And if we start there, then we're going to be more successful.
And as I mentioned, one of the neighborhoods you're working in is Smoketown
Yeah.
neighborhood, which is just south of Broadway, basically, and down near the Health Sciences campus, near downtown Louisville. So what does Smoketown have that's a basis for improving the health and working on things as far as culture?
Yeah, so many things. First of all, Smoketown is 152 years old. It is the oldest African-American community in the state of Kentucky, founded by formerly enslaved people immediately following the Civil War. Muhammad Ali learned to box in Smoketown. So when you think about the things that help to define us as a city, Smoketown has always played a really big role. And like you said, it's right across Broadway from the Health Sciences campus. And through a history of redlining and urban renewal, whether you're in Louisville or whether you're in Cleveland or whether you're in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins, any place there's a downtown health sciences campus, you can almost in case by case look right next door to those campuses. And you're going to find a low-income community, and a lot of times it's a community of color that have been decimated by historical policies. And so over the course of the years, we have managed to import some of the greatest science that we have and technology that we have right into the middle of our cities, but that community right next door is often not receiving the benefit from that. And over the years, that has led to an increasing level of mistrust between communities and health science providers. We think about access a lot as being a geography thing. Well, Smoketown's right next door to the largest
they can walk across the street to several hospitals.
That's right. And so and what's interesting about trust is, especially medical mistrust, which is what we focused on, it can be measured, and that's what we've done. And if you can measure it, you can manage it, right?
So there's a scale you've measured?
Yes, that's right.
What do you call it? The MMI or something like
the
that?
Medical Mistrust Index.
Okay.
And the thing about medical mistrust that's important to understand is that the higher your score, it's a predictor of access to utilization of preventative health services. So if you score high on the Medical Mistrust Index, it results in an underutilization of those preventative services that are so very important.
So you're less likely to go to the doctor.
That's
you're less
right.
likely to show up for a physical or to get blood work done, those kinds of things, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And so the Health Justice Scholars Program that was started by Dr. Faye Jones, who is the head of D&I, Diversity and Inclusion, on the Health Sciences campus, has engaged this work that we've been doing, and Malika Sabrawal, who's a medical student, has been working with us for about 2 years, actually, doing this project, and the measurement project that was initially hers.
Okay. Again, we're talking with Theo Edmonds, who's an assistant professor in health management in the School of Public Health and Information Sciences at the University of Louisville. So what are you doing? So what's U of L doing in that Smoketown neighborhood to perhaps try and turn around that mistrust? I assume there's a high level of mistrust.
There is.
Among some of the residents there, to try and turn that around and improve the health outcomes in Smoketown.
Yeah, it's really exciting. I think what we're getting ready to do is going to be a model that communities all across the country will ultimately want to emulate. So we've taken the medical mistrust research that we've done, but we've also been, for the last about 3 or 4 years, engaging with about 12 or 13 different organizations that are based in Smoketown, from Mazik Middle School to Bates Community Development Corporation, Bates Memorial Church, Youth Build. And so it's a pretty interesting breadth and scope of the foundational organizations that make up the community. And we are getting ready to put in place what we call the Hope Box. Most people think about hope, they think of it as just kind of optimism or positive thinking, but there again, hope can be measured. And so hope is the leading indicator of both childhood and adult well-being. And so what the Hope Box is going to do, we're converting an old liquor store into a working laundromat, which functions for increasing levels of communication and social cohesion. And so if you're going to be there a couple of times a week, what else can we, partner with the community on? So we're going to have a business incubator that's devoted to creating worker-owned co-ops with the skill sets that exist already in the Smoketown neighborhood. We've partnered with a number of departments and colleges from across the university, from the law school to the business school, been helping us with that piece of it. We're going to have a compassion clinic, and it's a partnership with the University of Louisville School of Medicine, School of Dentistry, and School of Nursing, driven by the School of Public Health, that will create an opportunity for medical students and the next generation of medical professionals to actually participate in the growth of the Smoketown community and learn how to incorporate the values of that community into their medical planning.
So basically, you're making a laundromat a place for people to gather from the Smoketown neighborhood, but perhaps applying all these other services to that as well, the medical, health. What else did you say? There was something else in there.
There's the business incubator.
The business incubator.
And then there's also going to be a Children's Defense Fund Freedom School that will be a partnership with Bates that will be in there. So, when we think about health, healthy, wealthy, and wise, all wrapped up right into one project based on hope.
And Heart of a Champion, what is that, and how does that fit in with what U of L is working on in health-wise?
Yeah, Heart of a Champion, super exciting. That's being driven by Karen Chavez, who's the Chief of Staff at the School of Medicine, and Dr. Erica Sutton, who does surgery on Sunday, and a number of other wonderful things, and a number of community partners. So that has been a precursor kind of pilot to what will become the Compassion Clinic, and it is a opportunity focused on kind of leveraging the frame of the cultural icon Muhammad Ali, who learned to box there in Smoketown, and looking at heart health and conducting a number of preventative health clinics all around Smoketown, in churches and schools and places where people are already gathering. So rather than waiting for them to come to us, we're coming to them.
We're going to them.
Yeah.
And Kentucky, another show that I did that was on yesterday, I guess it was, we talked about the rankings, the America's Health Rankings, and how Kentucky is, I think, last in smoking, cardiovascular disease, we're like 49th or something like that. So these are the things that we're talking about in that neighborhood that you're going out and reaching out to those folks to try and grab them to do some preventive health, I assume, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But again, always building from an asset-based approach. Like if I describe it to people like this sometimes. If the public health approach, or the health sector's approach in general, is to go and tell a community everything that's got it wrong with it and it needs to change. So if you and I were going, if we were going to date, and I came to you and said, here's all the things I see that's wrong with you. We know there's no wedding bells anytime soon.
Yeah.
But if we take a different approach and we think about building up trust and building up hope and capability and capacity by working together, it becomes a completely different value proposition.
Very good. Well, I work closely with, and I have a lot of friends at Grace Hope Presbyterian Church right in the middle of Smoketown.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm sure they'd love to work with you as well. So, all right, Theo, I appreciate you being on the show. Thanks for talking about this great project down in Smoketown. That'll about do it for this edition of UofL Today with Mark Hebert, which you can hear every Monday and Tuesday night on 93.9 The Ville. You can also catch the videos on UofL's YouTube page if you want to go there and see some of the shows on video. Check out all the UofL news, events, and programming at uflnews.com. Thanks for listening, and go Cards!